the Scottish Institute for Policing Research for collaborating with us on this initiative, on this webinar, and thanks to Detective Sergeant Frank Keegan, who is the head of the Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit in Police Scotland. He's going to be sharing the presentation with me today. The goal of the webinar really is to reach out to you as either police officers with different responsibilities in Police Scotland, and also policing researchers in Scotland who might be interested in our project. So we're going to basically tell you about the project today, tell you a little bit about the work that Police Scotland does in domestic abuse, domestic violence, gender-based violence work, and then open it up for any questions and invite you to participate, hopefully, in a survey and in any ongoing activities that we're organising as part of this project. So let's see if I can get this to work. So I'll start off just by giving you a bit of an introduction to the JUSTISIGNS 2 project, and I should have introduced myself. My name's Jemina Napier, Professor Jemina Napier, and I work at Heriot-Watt University in the Department of Languages and Intercultural Studies. So I'm the project manager, if you like, for this JUSTISIGNS 2 project, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment. I'll also talk to you a bit about the deaf women's experiences of gender-based violence and what we do already know. We don't know very much, but the little we do know I'll share with you. And then Detective Sergeant Keegan will go on to give a brief overview from Police Scotland and from the Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit. I've got a typo there, I've just noticed it says uni, it should say unit. And then we'll give a little bit more detail about the JUSTISIGNS 2 project and then open it up for any questions at the end. So just to give you some background, this actually is kind of a springboard really off a previous project, which was called JUSTISIGNS, and that project specifically focused on how deaf people who are British Sign Language users might interact with the police when they first come into contact with the police, or if they're being interviewed by the police, what experiences that they would have. And we were particularly keen to think about how the police understood the role of sign language interpreters and how interpreters understood the role of the police and their goals when coming into contact with deaf people, so that we could form best practices, if you like, for deaf people accessing police services, and best practices for police officers and interpreters to work together so that we could maximise that, whatever that experience was. And so this was a project, a European project. It was a 30-month project. So like I say, that was a more general overview, if you like, of policing. And we did look at the whole of the UK, but we worked very closely with Police Scotland, and Stephanie Rose, who's here with us, I believe, today, has worked with us for a long time on this project and others, focusing on the needs of deaf BSL users in Scotland. So she has a lot of expertise in the police with the deaf community. So as a result of the JUSTISIGNS project, we produced a whole load of outputs, and you're welcome to go to the website. All of the resources are still there. So we developed a range of toolkits for police officers, also for interpreters, guidelines, best practice guidelines. We also developed CPD materials, like training materials that can be used by anybody to provide training. And we actually offered various forms of training and masterclasses to police officers and to interpreters. And we had a really fun day, actually, one day out at Gartcosh, where we brought together investigative interviewers and trainers of interviewers with interpreters and with deaf people. And we did role plays of, okay, what's that like when you get together? How do you work together? And we sort of brainstormed a lot of that. And it was a really effective training session. So we're hoping to replicate some of that within this project as well. But out of the JUSTISIGNS project, because there was a lot of the research that's been done around interpreting in legal settings tends to focus on court. There's quite a body of work around spoken language interpreters, so people working with different minority languages, for migrants in particular, refugees. There's a very small amount of research that's on sign language interpreting, and it tends to be in court. So our project, the JUSTISIGNS project, was one of the first projects to really focus on the police context and how sign language interpreters needed to work with police officers. So through our investigations in that project, one area that we identified that was particularly under-resourced, particularly under-researched, and really needed to have a lot more exploration to help us better understand how to work in these contexts, was domestic, sexual and gender-based violence areas, and how the experiences that deaf women have in particular, and also what training was available for sign language interpreters to specialise perhaps working in this area, and whether police officers understood how to work with sign language interpreters, but not just police officers either, also others who might give support to deaf women. So quite often the police might be the first point of contact, but there'll also be refuges and different support services provided, like domestic abuse advisors and so on, who would also come into contact with deaf women. So we're working with a whole range of different organisations to try and sort of bring this all together so we can all benefit from this new knowledge. So this is really what led to this project. When we identified this area of need, we applied for more funding and we were successful. So it's a European project across 3 different countries, and so I'm responsible for leading on the UK arm of it, if you like. Being based in Scotland, I think that we can privilege the Scottish context a little bit more, but we do have a role to try and take in a sort of an overview, if you like, for the whole of the UK. But we are very much focusing on the Scottish context because there seems to be a real lack of support for deaf women specifically in Scotland. There are some services in England and Wales, but not necessarily in Scotland at the moment. So just to give a very brief definition of what we mean by gender-based violence, the United Nations defines violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in, or is likely to result in, physical, sexual or mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. And so here in the UK, we tend to talk a lot more about domestic abuse, and the legislation usually is focusing around the term of domestic abuse. Here in Scotland, we talk about violence against women and girls. So the terminology is slightly varied, and our project actually uses the term gender-based violence because that tends to be the term that's used more in the European context, and our funding is European. So we know that domestic abuse is one form of, or domestic violence is one form of gender-based violence. So we tend to refer to this broader concept of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, which encompasses all of those things and the experiences that deaf women in particular might have. Okay, so that's just giving you a brief overview to get us to this point. And I'm going to then tell you a little bit more about what we know already. So what are the experiences of deaf women in terms of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence? There isn't very much that we know, actually, especially not in the UK. The only sort of statistics that we can really draw upon here in the UK are from research that's been done around people with disabilities, generally disabled people and disabled survivors of domestic abuse. And that can pick up the needs of deaf people. However, our focus is very specific. So it's not on deaf people in general, people who have a hearing loss. We're actually focusing very specifically on deaf people who use British Sign Language. So therefore, their needs, they're not just necessarily seeing themselves as being disabled, but also as members of a language minority. For those of you who are familiar, we have the British Sign Language Scotland Act, which was enacted in 2015, which legally recognises British Sign Language as a national language here in Scotland. British Sign Language has also been recognised by the UK government back in 2003, but not legally yet. They just kind of recognise that, yes, it is a language separate to English and the equivalent of other minority languages that are used here in the UK. So deaf people kind of occupy this unique position, sort of an intersection, if you like, across being a disabled group, can thought of as a disabled group, but also thought of as a language minority group. And so, but the provisions that we have for providing sign language interpreters and access, if you like, are covered through the Equalities Act, the 2010 Equalities Act, which encompasses all people, all disabled people, as well as deaf BSL users. But now that we have this legislation in Scotland, the BSL Scotland Act, then that gives us an opportunity to draw upon that legislation and the national plan that accompanies it, which says that we are required, if you like, to promote BSL in Scotland and make sure that services, any public services, are accessible in BSL, whether it's directly or through interpreters. So to go back to what the research shows us and what we know already, we do know that generally disabled people do experience a higher rate of domestic abuse than non-disabled people. And there was a crime survey for England and Wales only in 2015, and it did report that women and men with a long-standing illness or disability are more than twice as likely to experience some form of domestic abuse than others who have no long-standing illness or disability. So this is a sort of general picture of the experiences of disabled people. And further research was conducted by the organisation Safe Lives, which also has branches here in Scotland, and they found that disabled victims of domestic abuse tend to experience more severe and frequent abuse over a longer period of time than non-disabled victims. And quite often they might have experienced some level of domestic abuse or gender-based violence for at least, on average 3 years before they access support, before they report it, compared to only 2 years for non-disabled victims. And then finally, even after receiving support, disabled victims are 8% more likely to continue to experience abuse. So we know that basically that the experiences of disabled people are typically worse than your average population. So Safe Lives said that there could be a number of factors for that. It could be because of their services aren't commissioned properly, or there's not enough services, or they're not in the right areas. There could be a lack of understanding for those people, the services that are commissioned, whether they actually have an understanding of how to support people that are disabled. There could also be risks from social stereotyping, so people making assumptions about disabled people and why they're experiencing abuse or how they're experiencing some form of abuse. And the last point is actually the key point for us for when we consider deaf people, is that the services may not be accessible. And many people, when you think of disabled people, you think of inaccessibility being around accessing buildings to meet with people, and so on and so forth. But when we're talking about deaf people, it means that they can't access the language of those services. So a lot of helplines, for example, are offered over the phone, and deaf people might not be able to access those and want to have a BSL provision. And the services providing the support might not be able to access interpreters, or might not have funding to access interpreters. So it kind of tends to go around and around a little bit. So when we think about deaf people, as I've mentioned, they use British Sign Language, the intersection between being members of a disability group and a linguistic and cultural minority group. We do have this legislative, I can never say that word, legislative protection, but we can't assume that deaf people are all the same, in the same way that we can't assume that all disabled people are the same, or any victim of domestic abuse of some kind have the same experiences. And many people might assume that just writing notes or people being able to read would be sufficient. But often for deaf people, even if they're bilingual, so most deaf people are bilingual to a point because they are surrounded by English here in the UK, but they still might prefer to use, or feel more comfortable to use, British Sign Language, either because it's their first language or their preferred language. And depending on their level of literacy, they might not feel comfortable only accessing information in English. And if you think about the sensitivities, especially in any services or support given around domestic abuse, then people are often going to be feeling vulnerable. They're going to perhaps not be able to focus. And so if you think about accessing information about a highly sensitized issue for you, where you're feeling vulnerable and you're having to access it in your second, third, fourth language, then that can be problematic. And in the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it actually specifically says that deaf people have the right to access services in sign language, either directly or through professional interpreters in any public service setting. So this is all well and good in principle, but then we need to think about how that happens in practice. So we know a little bit about disabled people's experiences, the experiences of disabled victims, but when we try to drill down a bit more to find out more about deaf women's experiences, there's actually very, very little research. Most of it is in the United States, and it's very ad hoc. But again, it would seem that there is increased risk of, you'll see the acronym we use here, domestic sexual gender-based violence, DSGBV, among deaf women. There tends to be a prevalence of intimate partner abuse. So those deaf women who do report some kind of abuse, often it will be from the, physical abuse or emotional or psychological abuse from their partner. There have been suggestions for what the factors could be that might influence that. So the inability to hear contributes to a level of vulnerability, can be a perceived barrier. So, for example, if a deaf woman wants to report to the police quickly, they might only have a short window of opportunity where they can do that. And if they can't access the telephone or can't access other services, then they're actually in a disadvantaged position. This particular piece of research by Crow talks about a power imbalance potentially between deaf and hearing partners. So hearing partners perhaps might use their hearing status to coerce or control deaf individuals. And but then likewise, deaf abusers can also actually control and coerce because they do understand sign language and they do understand their partner's position. And for example, if they see them looking at someone else signing, or they might accuse them of being attracted to someone else, and so on. So it's complex. You know, it's not straightforward, as we know that anything to do with domestic abuse is highly sensitive and complex. But what we don't know that much about deaf women's experiences. We do know from this study in the US that deaf survivors are more likely to report their experiences if their partner is deaf than they are if they have hearing partners. I'm not entirely sure why. There's a new project actually happening just now through this organisation called Signs HWU, which is an English-based organisation that does provide direct support to deaf women by deaf women in British Sign Language. They have qualified independent domestic abuse, domestic violence advisors, and they're now undertaking a project with Manchester Metropolitan University where they're seeking to interview deaf women who've been through the experience of domestic or sexual or gender-based violence, but have never accessed sign health services. So they're actually doing a review around their own services and what kind of services they can provide. And we're hoping that we're actually collaborating with Sign Health on this project as well. They're one of the partners that are working with us. And we're hoping that some of the recommendations out of our own project might be that Sign Health could receive funding to extend into Scotland, or an equivalent service could be established here in Scotland so that deaf women can go directly to a service which has been commissioned to support deaf women specifically. So as I was saying, there's virtually no research on deaf women's experiences, but there's even less on how sign language interpreters can work in this context with deaf women. Because we do know that the ideal would be for deaf women to be able to go to services like Sign Health, where they could receive support in British Sign Language directly from either deaf women or other women who can sign, or other service providers who can sign. But we do know that that's not always possible depending on where they live. So here in Scotland, for example, you wouldn't be able to access Sign Health services. So you would have to approach the police, potentially contact the police, and receive support from organisations such as Wise Women or Scottish Women's Aid. And they would have to have interpreters present in order to be able to access the services that could be provided, because they're not directly accessible in British Sign Language. Also, a lot of information about domestic abuse is, even if it's on websites, it's in English, in text form, spoken form. Sometimes it's translated into other languages, but there's not much information in BSL available out there. So for interpreters, you imagine there isn't much training available for them. Again, the only research that we know of has been done in the United States, not here in the UK context. But we do know that as deaf and deafblind women and children are at risk of being long-term victims, if they can't access linguistically and culturally appropriate services, then they're going to have to access support through sort of what we would call mainstream services through interpreters. But it seems that often people don't understand what qualifications interpreters need, where to find them, and how to recruit them. And so a lack of provision of sign language interpreters can have a double impact, if you like, on deaf women, because not only are they experiencing barriers in accessing direct services, but if an interpreter is not provided, then it can actually prolong the wait for them to receive support or access to information. So it's really important for us to sort of consider, and this is really the goal of this project, is to think about, well, what are the best practices to be employed by interpreters when interpreters going in and working in a setting either with in the police context where someone might be interviewed about what they're reporting, or in a counselling or support service, what the goals are, and therefore how interpreters can best work with either police officers or other support service providers to ensure the safety of deaf victims of domestic, sexual or gender-based violence. So really the goal of our project is to do some fact-finding, to do some research, to find out about the experiences, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute, and then to come up with some recommendations for all key stakeholders. So I'm going to hand over now, before I talk a bit more about the project, I'm going to hand over to Detective Sergeant Frank Keegan from Police Scotland, the Domestic Violence Coordination Unit, as I mentioned earlier. I'm just going to share his PowerPoint. He's got a slightly different one, and then I'm going to move through for him. So Frank, if you wanted to, there you go, I can see you now. Just going to share your PowerPoint, and hopefully somebody will let me know if you can see that.
Yep, I can see it.
You can see it?
Yep, all good.
Everyone else see that? Yep.
Yep.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Frank Keegan, the DS at Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit. I was asked by Professor Jemina Napier and PC Stephanie Rose to assist with this webinar this afternoon. My part of it basically is just to give a brief overview of domestic abuse from Police Scotland's perspective, a bit of information about it, the structure we have in order to deal with it, and some things that we try and implement in order to negate domestic abuse and try and assist victims of domestic abuse. So it's a quick run through. I'm conscious of the time and want to leave some time at the end for some questions. Just move on, please, Jemina. So similar to obviously the general definition from the European side is different from Police Scotland. We don't have a familiar or carer link to any domestic abuse. And our definition is any form of physical, verbal, sexual, psychological or financial abuse which might amount to criminal conduct and which takes place within the context of a relationship. The relationship will be between partners, and that's married, cohabiting, civil partnership or otherwise, or ex-partners. The abuse can be committed in the home or elsewhere, including online. And we also have a joint protocol with Police Scotland and the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service for domestic abuse, and that is a forward-facing document that you can get online that explains all that for us. We can skip on. So the priority for Police Scotland is dealing with victims of domestic abuse and prioritising the safety of them and their family, partner, anywhere else, maybe in the house at the time, children, etc. And that's what the joint protocol's for. So on average, it's actually just over that, the last couple of years, over 60,000 domestic incidents a year is recorded by Police Scotland. So the demand for that on the organisation is huge, and the impact that has on the victims likewise. So the stats from a couple of years ago was that 82% of perpetrators were male, and 34% of that had previously been recorded, so it was repeat victims and repeat perpetrators. 74% of the victims were female, and 26 of them had previously been recorded, so they were repeat victims. So there was a trend of repeat perpetrators and repeat victims, and it was how then Police Scotland react to that and try and work with that. We can skip on again. So the frightening stat is every 9 minutes, and that's what we've been running with as an organisation and ad campaigns for the last few years. Due to the volume that we have reported, we do receive a domestic incident every 9 minutes. And the slogan, "We're coming for you," was initially for perpetrator based, to say that we were coming out to get the perpetrator, but you could always put a slant on that it's a message to the victim that we're coming to protect you and we're coming out to support you. The analysis of the demand on that for every 9 minutes, it actually takes up on average 20% of all operational policing time to respond to domestic incidents. So a fifth of all police work is dealt with domestic incidents. 88% of domestic incidents occur within the home, and that's obviously where the difficulty lies with us investigating and detecting domestic incidents, because it's all behind closed doors and a lot of time there's no other witnesses. So it's how we then as an organisation deal with that moving forward. If we skip on, I'll show the structure of how we do that, please. So in Police Scotland, this is the main part for us. We've got a 3-tier approach to kind of our response to domestic abuse. So in order to attend and deal with these 60,000 incidents, Tier 1 is response policing, and that's the officers that deal with the initial part of every single domestic incident. So they'll deal with 60,000 of these incidents, and that's the guys in the front. So that's represented by the red dots across the country, and that's the 13 territorial divisions that have all the response officers that will deal with that. So they receive the appropriate training in order so that they can deal with that and highlight anything else that would need to be pushed up the tiers to get addressed with the more serious incidents, etc. And they're also every division will have the Tier 2, which is a domestic abuse specialist, domestic abuse investigation units, or a public protection unit up in A Division in Aberdeen, and the rest are all domestic abuse investigation units. So Tier 2 are all where they provide support to Tier 1 officers. They'll deal with more complex cases, often be more protracted. It will take more time to carry out the investigations. They are all specially trained officers. They've got extra specialist training in relation to sexual offences, joint investigative interviews with children, etc. And their role is to assist their territorial divisions with investigating and detecting domestic abuse and safety planning for the victims of domestics. On Tier 3 above that, we have the Domestic Abuse Task Force, which is split into East, West and North from the country. And again, that's a step up again. It's a small amount of officers across the country that will deal with the more serious cases, more serious complex cases that require cross boundaries, multiple partners, more protracted cases. And again, they're all trained to a higher level, and they'll deal with the worst case domestic abuse cases and perpetrators. The red triangle at the back is ourselves at the Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit. We'll provide support to officers in all 3 stages, as well as we're in charge of the policy for stalking, harassment, honour-based abuse, forced marriage. And we'll deal with the policy and support training from across the country. We'll deliver training to first-line managers just promoted. We'll deliver inputs in domestic abuse. We have an accredited course for Procurator Fiscal Service where we deliver inputs for them, and various other training courses that we'll have inputs on, as well as being a point of contact for all Tier 1, 2, 3 officers across the country, and keep them abreast of all the up-to-date information across the country. So ultimately, move on please. Prevention is key. What we want to do is, the ideal scenario is to prevent a domestic incident from happening. So there's a lot of work goes on. Rightly so, we identified years ago in Police Scotland that we can't do this alone, and it's up to us collaborating with partner agencies and how we can then prevent domestic from happening. It's identifying things at an early point where we can signpost someone to the right agency, partner agency, that can assist with them, and then hopefully prevent further domestic incidents occurring as we go on. So one of the most important things we've got for that is the disclosure scheme for domestic abuse Scotland.
I think we lost you. I've lost your sound a bit there, Frank.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks. I think you're off the microphone.
Sorry. Yeah, so we've got a disclosure scheme for domestic abuse Scotland. Wee bit of history behind that, as most people probably know. It came from down south, Clarewood. There was a mother of one killed by her boyfriend, George Appleton, who, unbeknown to her, had a history of violence against women. Her body was discovered at home in Salford, Greater Manchester, in February 2009, and she'd been strangled and set on fire. So he became known as a Facebook killer, as he trawled social media in search of partners. Months before her murder, Claire had actually contacted Greater Manchester Police several times, reporting that she'd been harassed, stalked, attempted to rape her, and she was very badly let down by their service, and they didn't take her seriously. Claire had actually told her father that she was aware that he'd had a criminal record, however it was just for motoring offences and nothing of a domestic nature, when in fact he had been in jail for 3 years in 2002 for harassing another woman, and 6 months the year before, and had a restraining order from another ex-partner. So the inquest into that, the coroner deemed that all women should have a right to find out if their partner's being abusive, and that was her dad that fought for that, hence the name Clare's Law down south. And in October 2015, we launched the disclosure scheme for domestic abuse Scotland, DSGBV, or DSGBV as it's commonly known. And basically that was for the same thing. It's to provide a formal process for sharing information with individuals at risk of domestic abuse due to the risk posed to them by a partner, as assessed by Police Scotland. So it's a database that's there in order for us to make a disclosure if the risk is posed high enough for them to inform a decision on whether or not to continue that relationship or not. Not for us to tell them they can't, it's us to give them the information to see if they want to end that relationship. So the scheme itself, if we can skip on, has two pathways. We have the right to ask, have the power to tell. The right to ask is an important part for general member of the public and partner agencies and professionals, etc. So basically, if you're in a relationship, you're concerned that the other person may have an abusive past, then you've got the right to ask. If you're worried about your friend, if you're sitting having a meal or talking to a friend, they're talking about a new relationship and you're highlighting there's be some coercive control or other issues in that relationship, you've got the right to ask. If you're worried about a relative, again, you've got the right to ask. So there's many different ways that we would form that'd be a competent application to submit and to see if there's any risk posed to your family member, friend, etc. So the process itself should be completed within 45 days, just to keep this kind of brief. If there is a history of domestic abuse and high risk to that person or risk to that person, a decision-making forum with police and two partner agencies, they will decide then if they're going to disclose information, and a form of words of a disclosure will be made to the person at risk. So you're putting an application in for your mother, your sister. It's not you that gets the information, it is the person at risk that gets the information. And you won't know about that, but you've done the right thing and got them safe information required. The flip side of that, we have the power to tell, which is for basically police and partner agencies to hold information, keep people safe, and submit the application, and it's the exact same process, and the disclosure is not made at the end of that. Just a bit of figures. Since it was launched in 2015, these figures are accurate as of last week or 2 weeks ago. It's been 11,219 applications made on the system, so it is increasing every year, and it is getting used. Very good use of both right to ask and power to tell year on year. So anybody can, as I said, can make the application. You can, if you can skip on how to make the application, you can make it online on the internet, and you can attend at any police station, contact any police officer, phone 101, and to the report, make an application, and that the application gets filled out after. Online reporting, it's a very straightforward form, and all I would say is we just, even if it's for the police side, for the power to tell, is as much information as possible to highlight any risk. All the information is on the Scotland website, and contact Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit if need be for any further information. That's try to rush through that as much as possible so we can see if we've got time for any questions. Anybody?
Oh. Here we go, and there's further information there which we can share again at the end. So I'll just perhaps if I jump back into the other presentation so we can just up and see if there's any questions. So just bear with me while I open the other presentation again. Wonders of technology. Okay, so I'm just going to share the other one. Hopefully it will still be, I'm hoping it might still be on the same page. If not, I'm going to have to. Right, let me know what you can see when you can see it.
Back to the start, Jemina.
Is it? Okay. Yeah. I can just see it coming up on my screen now, so I'll just whiz through first few. Would you like to resume from slide 13? Yes, I would. Thank you very much. There you go. So hopefully that's, yep, brought me back to where I handed over to you. So yes, so just to come back to telling you a little bit more about the JUSTISIGNS 2 project, which is one of the reasons that we're here today, as Detective Sergeant Keegan mentioned, one of the primary goals of Police Scotland is prevention. And you might have noticed that when he was talking about how to make an application to the Domestic Abuse Information Service, that there is a logo for Contact Scotland. So this is actually a video relay service where people can call and they can access that information or access that service through a British Sign Language interpreter. The provision of BSL interpreting through video relay is something that we've investigated. We actually had a PhD student at Heriot-Watt, and we've worked again closely with Police Scotland and Stephanie Rose, Constable Stephanie Rose, on that project to look at the viability of using video relay interpreting and when it's appropriate and so on. So it still seems to be ad hoc and a little bit inconsistent when interpreters are provided either face-to-face or by video. But that is available. That service is a Scottish Government funded service, Contact Scotland, for all public services in Scotland. So our project, as I mentioned earlier, is a European funded project. It's funded through the European Commission, and we're working in partnership with universities in Spain and Ireland, and also with the European Union of the Deaf, which is based in Belgium. But we've also set up our own UK advisory group so that we can actually work with key stakeholders here in the UK to support us in this sort of outreach. So as Detective Sergeant Keegan said, working with key collaborators, with key stakeholders is a really important way to ensure that we're all sharing the same message and thinking about the same services. So we work with the Association of Sign Language Interpreters for the UK. We're also collaborating with the British Deaf Association, which supports the needs of deaf BSL users, with Sign Health, the charity that I mentioned earlier, and also with Wise Women, which is an organisation in Glasgow that's done a lot of support and actually did have a project for a short period to support deaf women, and also Scottish Women's Aid as well. So and Police Scotland as well are also involved in our advisory group. So our goal is really to, I just realised I didn't move the slides across, there you go. So that's the partners that we're working with and the UK partners on our advisory group. So our goal is to focus on deaf women, and here in the UK, our Spanish partners are actually looking at refugees, women who are refugees or who are migrants who might speak other languages. So we're actually having a kind of more holistic overview, if you like, of that. But as I've already given an overview, so I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. We're focusing on deaf women here in the UK. We'll be looking to produce very similar outputs that we did with the JUSTISIGNS project. So we will be offering, the project runs technically until May next year, but we're pretty confident we're going to get a 6-month extension because we did start, we had a delayed start because of the lockdown. So we're hoping that we'll actually have another 18 months, and our goal is to provide more training opportunities for police officers, but also for other healthcare professionals, support service providers, for interpreters, perhaps together on some occasions, and some more information sessions, and also work with the deaf community to develop materials in British Sign Language so we can bring in that prevention aspect. So if they have access to information, then they might understand preventative measures rather than only reactive measures when something happens to them. So we're looking at reaching out to all of these stakeholder groups. And our priorities, as were set out in the proposal, were to develop training materials, to develop toolkits for all of the different stakeholder groups, best practice guidelines for working together for any professionals in this context, so interpreters, police officers, healthcare workers, support service providers, and so on. And I'm actually having a little bit of a problem seeing my slides. They're very small, but one of the key aspects is actually to collect data. So because we want it to be research-based, evidence-based, so that all our training materials and toolkits, anything that we develop to have real impact, we think that they need to draw upon information from those people either who are experiencing the domestic abuse themselves, so deaf women themselves, also from interpreters if they've worked in the area or not. Like if they do work in the area, what do they find challenging? If they don't, why not? Is it because they find it perhaps a little bit scary to think about working in this context because it's highly sensitive and they're working with very vulnerable people, so they might not feel they have sufficient experience or expertise. So what do they feel they need in terms of training? Also, what other support service providers and police officers feel that they need? Do they understand what it is that deaf women need? How to best work with sign language interpreters? So we're in the process now of actually collecting data, and this is our data collection phase, if you like, and then from that we'll extract the information about training needs, hopefully have a better picture of what the experience is like for deaf women here in the UK, because as I mentioned earlier, we don't really have much information, and then we will develop training materials and so on. So we'll continue to work with Police Scotland and other partners to do that, and hopefully provide more opportunities through SIPR to do these information sharing sessions as well. If you're interested, we have a survey that we're asking police officers to complete along with other support service providers. We've extended the deadline to after today, so hoping we might capture a few of you and your interest to fill in the survey. It just asks you questions about if you've ever met a deaf person before or worked with another person from another language, what challenges did you experience? Did you know how to work with an interpreter? Did you bring in an interpreter? How you went about that, even if you've never had that experience, if you've never met anyone or worked with an interpreter before, what do you think the challenges could be? What do you know what the protocols are if you were to face that situation? So we would really appreciate it if you would consider sharing that information. So let me just see if I can. I just realised I forgot to move on again to the survey. Here we go. So there's the link, and perhaps we can. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Monica's just put it in the chat as well, so it's easy for people to copy or click on. And I think I can't read my slide. What we said the deadline was, but I think it's the end of this week. So if you either be willing to fill it in yourself or to share it. I know Detective Sergeant Frank Keegan has already shared it through a lot of his contacts through the Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit, and Constable Stephanie Rose has also shared it through her contacts. So, and SIPR have also shared it through theirs. So we have actually sent it out a lot, but we're hoping just to capture a few more if we can. So on that note, that's it from us. That actually gives us about 10 minutes, but here's some information about, if you do want more information about the project, feel free to contact me. I'm on Twitter, or you can email me, and we're happy to take any questions that you might have now. So I think I'll stop presenting. We're happy for people to keep, because there's quite a small group, it'd be nice if people would be willing to have their cameras on and ask any questions. Perhaps raise your hand and Monica will help us to coordinate that. We'll see how we get on. Okay. Excellent. So I'm not sure if any questions are already put in the chat. I can't see the chat function.
Nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, thanks, Monica. Did you have any comments or questions, David Rutherford?
Hi there, nice to meet you. Thanks very much for that presentation. I don't think I know any of you apart from Stephanie. Me and Stephanie have spoken before regarding a project that I'm currently leading called Pegasus. Scotland, so it's a kind of scheme down south, England and Wales, where we are trying to remove barriers of communication for persons to contact the Police Scotland. So I work in the governance and improvement team within the C3 division, Contact Command and Control. So I came back from annual leave yesterday and I was given the information of this kind of webinar that's on, so I signed up to it late yesterday, so thanks very much for getting me involved. Really, for me, just kind of looking for some information or even kind of contacts that can help get Pegasus off the ground. Basically, the idea of Pegasus was thought of by a male called Chris Channon, sorry, who has cerebral palsy. And he was basically the victim of a crime down in Nottinghamshire. And he used to contact the police regularly to report antisocial behaviour. And due to communication difficulties, he was thought of as a nuisance caller, and his call was frequently terminated. Now, it obviously touches on deaf people, however, also anyone with a communication difficulty, whether that be through disability or mental health. So we are kind of really keen to come up with a kind of better scheme, if you like, than they've already got in England and Wales, take the best of what they've got and improve on it. So I'm quite open to any kind of discussions or contacts or any thoughts that anyone might have that could make it easier for someone who is deaf to report a crime, because at the end of the day, they're as entitled to report a crime as quickly as anyone else is. So really, it's just to kind of make you aware of that scheme that we are doing kind of research into, myself and my team, and any kind of thoughts or ideas you may have. Certainly I can put my email address on the chat function if anyone wants to get in touch with me regarding it. But I thought that this kind of webinar was really kind of helpful and insightful. So going forward, Stephanie will be working alongside us to try and get this rolling across the country. But obviously it's going to be a massive thing, The kind of idea behind Pegasus would be that everyone who subscribes to the voluntary scheme would be allocated with a unique PIN number that they would be able to get in a card format or a text message, and when they contact police they would give this PIN number, and that would allow our service advisors or police officers to bring up their information and exactly what their needs are, such as they need someone to do sign language for them, etc. So just to make you kind of aware of that, not a question as such, but if anyone's got any kind of ideas or anything, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and I'll put my email address in the chat.
Thanks, David. I think just to comment on that, and then to see if Frank wanted to say anything, but I think this, like you say, it's a broader issue, isn't it? Not just in relation to domestic abuse, but to everything, and also not just sign language users, but to communication in general. But I think it's great. If you're already, I was about to say, if you're already in contact with Stephanie Roche, that's the best person you need to be in contact with in Police Scotland for understanding how to communicate with or have contact with the deaf community. But I'm also happy to talk to you and to put you in touch with other deaf community organisations. I know Stephanie's got a lot of contacts, but yeah, I'll look out for your email and I'll drop you a line, and maybe we could take this offline and have a further conversation, because I'd be interested to hear more and see how we could support, and maybe our project can end up sort of dovetailing and maybe providing some information that might benefit your project.
Fantastic, thank you.
I wasn't sure if you wanted to chip in there, Frank, is there anything you wanted to add? But Stephanie's got her hand up.
I was going to raise another point, but Sarge, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to put in before I raise another point.
No, I didn't. I hadn't heard of that, David, before. So if you just keep in touch with us and let us know if you're on, if there's anything else we can do to assist, then I'm only Frank Keegan in the database. Just drop me an email and I'll catch up. Yeah,
we'll do. I think it's been something that has been thought of before, but just never kind of got off the ground type thing. But Police Scotland, we're way behind. I mean, this has been running in Nottinghamshire for years. A lot of the forces down south have got it, so we're quite eager, and the superintendent's quite eager to get this started. So certainly we're kind of pressing ahead as much as we possibly can and getting all the research done prior to presenting it. But briefing papers and stuff have been typed up and presented to chief inspectors so far, so we're making kind of good progress at this stage.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, I was just going to raise a point. Obviously, I worked with Jemina and our team on JUSTISIGNS, the original JUSTISIGNS, and now delighted to be involved in JUSTISIGNS 2. There's always so much brilliant stuff that comes out of these partnerships, so it's fantastic opportunity for us all in Police Scotland and any partners who are on the call to get involved, I would say. What point, I suppose, Jemina, is always, I don't know whether it's mission creep or if it all dovetails together, like you say, but we're talking about, obviously, the project being involved in training materials for, all the different parties within that process. But when Sergeant Keegan was doing his input right away, I was thinking, well, do we have BSL information and how to apply to the DSTAS, the disclosure scheme? So the minute you start thinking about one particular context, so gender-based violence and domestic abuse scenarios, it actually opens up, and I think we spoke about this in the community information event, that they've been able to contact the police and make any kind of report of domestic abuse right away. It stops people accessing their services. So I suppose I'm hopeful that the training and the creating awareness within our staff and the other partners on the project will lead to all the departments thinking of, well, is my information accessible and is contact methods accessible, as David just pointed out. So I'm not sure if accessing police at the first point is definitely on your radar. So I suppose my question is that does it become a wee bit of mission creep if we start to, or is it good learning that we pass on as part of the project?
Is that a question for me, Stephanie? I always think mission creep is good, because I think ultimately we're all working towards the same goals, aren't we? And as Frank said, the goal of prevention, if we can get that information out, whether it's in BSL format, so whether it's on websites and any other information that's available, and then people understand how they can make reports, make even sort of the definitions around domestic and gender-based violence, people understanding what they're experiencing actually is a form of abuse. So having that information available in BSL, making sure they understand how they can report, how they can get ongoing support in all of these different things. And then when they come into contact with whoever's giving them that support, and there are interpreters there, the interpreters understand how best to work with all of these different professionals. So I think it's really about squaring the circle, if you like. I don't really like that term, but it seems like the best term to use, where we're all really working towards the same goals. And I think if we can all inform each other on these different things. So I'd never heard of this Pegasus project before either, David. So I think it's great that this is happening. And if you're involved, Stephanie, it means that there is a consideration for deaf BSL users. They're not being left behind in that. So I think that's the more we can all talk to each other and have these kinds of information sharing sessions, the more we can all support each other to get there. Most definitely. who's that? Kevin, did you want to talk to that? You're saying you're leading a piece of public engagement at the moment. Would you like to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, sorry, Jemina. Hi, everyone. I wasn't sure if I would still have time, but yeah, the details are in the chat, but there is a survey on our engagement hub at the moment where we're really trying to, well, we're working with colleagues across Innovation and Victim Support Scotland and various other departments within policing to understand what that initial response should look like from, we're trying not to use the term victim, but for people who experience crime. And how they receive the best support possible into kind of support services or other forms of aftercare. So there's a survey live just now, and but it's a longer term piece of work, and there's other kind of public engagement lined up. So just if there's any partners on the call and for policing colleagues on the call, please please do share that widely within teams and whatever, because we're keen to get the word out into as many communities as possible. And I was just saying there is a BSL version available as well. So.
And that's great to see that there's a BSL version, because like I mentioned earlier on, people will often assume that deaf people are happy to read, but English might not be their first language, and so they might have, not be able to access the information quite as readily as they could if it was in BSL. So that's really great to see that's there. Thanks for that. I think it is 4 o'clock now, so I know that time is precious. So I think, Monica, we should probably think about wrapping up now.
Yep, absolutely. I suppose if there's any other questions, my contact details are obviously on the invite, and I'd be more than happy to pass them on to Jemina or whoever's the most appropriate contact if anyone didn't get to ask their questions. So please feel free to do that.
And so thanks again to Monica for helping us to organise the event today, and to SIPR for hosting the event. It's been a really nice collaboration, and thanks again to Detective Keegan Sergeant Keegan for participating and giving the perspective of Police Scotland and what services are available there, and to all of you for joining. I hope that you found it informative. I'll be following up with Stephanie Rose, who's on our advisory group, and also with Frank Keegan. So we'll keep you informed. We'll be writing a blog post soon, just with a sort of progress report update. We're actually about to recruit a new researcher onto the project to work with us, a deaf woman who herself has actually been through the experience of domestic abuse and has a really strong research background. So she's actually going to be able to bring sort of some of her personal experience, but also her research experience to support me on working through this project, which would be great. So we'll keep you posted through the SIPR connections, and have a good afternoon, good evening when it comes. Enjoy the sunshine while it's still there. And thanks again for joining, Saul.
Thanks all for joining, guys. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Bye.